I never thought my quiet, dusty ranch in the middle of nowhere would turn into a battlefield. But there it was, a cabin. Not just any cabin, but a pristine little lakeside getaway, slapped down like it had been dropped from the sky, except it hadn't. Someone had built it illegally, right on my property, and apparently, the HOA thought they could do whatever they wanted because, well, they called themselves an HOA. I still remember the first time I saw it. I had ridden my ATV over the rolling hills, coffee in hand, the sun just kissing the horizon, when I spotted a glint in the trees near the northern edge of my ranch. At first, I thought it was a hunting shack or maybe some bored neighbor trying to enjoy the piece of my land without permission. But as I got closer, my stomach sank. It was a cabin, new, expensive, and screaming we don't care about the law. A dock jutted into the tiny lake I'd fished in since I was a kid, and there was a little path lined with lanterns like something out of a fancy resort brochure. I parked my ATV, boots sinking into the soft earth, and walked closer. Every step felt like stepping on glass. Who in their right mind builds a full-blown vacation spot on someone else's land? My mind raced. Do I call the cops? The sheriff? Or do I just take matters into my own hands? By the time I reached the cabin, my decision had been made. I had spent years building, maintaining, and protecting this land, and no HOA, or anyone else, was going to waltz in and claim it as their own. I grabbed my tools, took a deep breath, and started flattening that cabin, piece by piece. I didn't think about consequences. I only thought about justice. Little did I know that single act of defiance would ignite a war I had no idea I was stepping into. I never thought a quiet morning on my ranch could turn into the start of a full-blown war. But there it was, shimmering like a neon sign in the middle of my property. A cabin. Not a run-down hunting shack or some forgotten tool shed, but a brand-new, lakeside, look-at-me cabin, sitting smugly where it had no right to be. I rubbed my eyes, convinced the desert sun was playing tricks on me. But no, there it was, and every fiber of my ranch owner brain screamed, "This is not yours." I had spent years turning this property into my sanctuary. Rolling hills, oak trees scattered like confetti, a tiny lake where I'd fished since I was a kid. This land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was memories, sweat, and pride. And now, apparently, the HOA thought they could waltz in and stake their claim. An HOA, on my land. I swear, if irony could be personified, it would be laughing at me right then. I parked my ATV at the edge of the property and approached the cabin cautiously, boots sinking into the soft earth. It wasn't huge, maybe a modest one-bedroom, but it had a dock, a little fire pit, and lanterns lining a manicured path to the lake, luxury touches that made it scream we don't care about laws or land ownership. My blood boiled. Who builds a vacation spot on someone else's property? Who thinks they can just do that? I circled the cabin, looking for any sign of a legal right to be there. None. Not a permit. Not a fence line. Not even a note in the mailbox. Just smug confidence. And that was the moment I made a choice. I grabbed my tools, sledgehammer, crowbar, and an old chainsaw I'd been keeping for emergencies. I didn't think about lawsuits, consequences, or the optics. I only thought about justice. My first swing hit the porch railing, and was splintered like brittle candy. I felt a rush, a mix of adrenaline, righteousness, and disbelief. Every plank I pulled down, every nail I bent back, felt like reclaiming a piece of my life. I was in my element. My ranch was my kingdom, and I was defending it. By the time the sun was high, the cabin was more debris than structure. I stood there, breathing heavy, looking over the ruins, feeling both victorious and terrified. Victory tastes sweet, but the first pangs of anxiety were already creeping in, because I knew this wasn't the end. It never is. Sure enough, a few days later, the letters started arriving. Official-looking, stamped, threatening. The HOA was suing me. Me. For flattening a cabin they had no right to build in the first place. I stared at the envelope, laughing until my chest hurt. They were mad? Mad at me for removing something illegal? The audacity was almost beautiful. But this was no joke. They meant business. And suddenly, my quiet life on the ranch felt like a battlefield. It wasn't just the HOA. It was their lawyers, their letters, their accusations of destruction of property and emotional distress. I wanted to scream at them. You built it illegally. You trespassed. But apparently, in legal language, that doesn't matter as much as my hasty sledgehammer work. Still, I couldn't regret what I did. Watching that cabin crumble, feeling the dust in my lungs, it was oddly cathartic. It was a moment I realized standing up for your property isn't just about land. It's about respect, boundaries, and refusing to be steamrolled by bureaucracy. And maybe, just maybe, it's about telling a story the world can't ignore. I began preparing for the fight. I documented everything: the cabin, my land, old survey maps, property deeds. I started photographing the debris in dramatic, almost cinematic ways, like evidence in a Western showdown. Each snapshot felt like armor against the impending legal storm. And then there were the neighbors. Some were shocked, some amused, and a few were outright cheering me on. Finally, one old rancher said, "Someone put those HOA jerks in their place." Their encouragement stoked a fire in me I didn't know I had. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was standing up for a principle, something larger than myself. As the first legal notices piled up, I realized I needed more than cameras and crowbars. I needed a strategy. And so I started digging, figuratively and literally, into the HOA's past actions. Their overreach wasn't new. Apparently, they had tried to build mini resorts on other people's land before, quietly, without permits. I couldn't believe it. These people had no shame, no sense of boundaries, and now they had chosen me as their target. The adrenaline that had fueled me during the cabin demolition was transforming into a different kind of energy, a calculated, methodical energy. I wasn't just a rancher with a sledgehammer anymore. I was a defender of my land, armed with knowledge, documentation, and a willingness to fight. But there was also fear. I'll admit it. Fear of courtrooms, lawyers, and endless paperwork. Fear that the system might favor them because sometimes bureaucracies protect their own. Fear that my little act of rebellion could cost me more than I bargained for. But beneath that fear, beneath the worry, was a stubborn certainty. I would not let my property, my sanctuary, be stolen. And so, standing on the edge of my now cabin-less lake, looking at the sun reflecting on the water, I made a silent vow. Let them sue me. Let them bring every lawyer they can afford. I would fight back, not just with tools, but with truth, with evidence, and with the sheer force of someone who refuses to back down. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The cabin had been just a spark. What came next would test my patience, my resolve, and my very sanity. But in that moment, dust in my hair, hands blistered, heart pounding, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Because sometimes, standing up for what's yours isn't just a choice. It's a story worth telling. I should have seen it coming, but somehow I didn't. After the dust settled on the Flattened cabin and the adrenaline faded, I thought maybe the HOA would think twice. Maybe they'd realize they were wrong. Maybe common sense would prevail. Spoiler, it didn't. It started with letters, thin envelopes with sharp edges, dripping authority. The first one arrived one morning with the kind of postmark that instantly makes your stomach drop. Destruction of property. Compensation demanded. They were claiming thousands of dollars. Thousands. For a cabin they didn't have a right to build in the first place. I laughed. Then I cried a little. But mostly, I swore. The next letter came with a subpoena. That was a fun surprise. Suddenly, my little sanctuary was no longer a ranch. It was a courtroom battlefield. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by coffee cups, notepads, and the debris from my old sledgehammer. I tried to think logically. Maybe I could settle this. Maybe there was a way to reason with them. But the more I read their letters, the clearer it became. This wasn't about reason. This was about power. And they thought they had it. I called a lawyer. That's when reality hit me like a freight train. Legal fees aren't cheap. Legal battles aren't romantic. They are exhausting, draining, and, above all, relentless. My lawyer, let's call him Sam, looked over the documents and shook his head. They don't care about property law. They are throwing every tactic at you to scare you into backing down. I could feel my stomach twist. But Sam also said something I'll never forget. And the good news? They don't have a case. Legally, this is your land. You documented everything. You have proof. Proof. That's what I had clung to after demolishing the cabin. Photographs of the structure, timestamps on my phone, historical surveys of my land, old permits that proved beyond a doubt the HOA had no claim. Still, knowing I was technically right didn't make the fight any less intimidating. Lawyers, courtrooms, and HOA committees were a different kind of battlefield than I was used to. The first day I stepped into court felt like walking into a gladiator arena. I wasn't wearing armor. I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, the smell of the ranch still clinging to my boots. Across the courtroom, their team looked sleek and confident. Suits, polished shoes, a kind of practiced authority that screamed experience. And then there was me, just a guy who flattened the cabin because it was illegal. The judge, a woman who could have been a drill sergeant in a past life, called the case. Her voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. "Mr. Jensen," she said, using my actual last name, "you are being sued for destruction of property. How do you plead?" I swallowed hard. "Not guilty, Your Honor," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. That was the start of the war. Their opening statements were a mix of theatrics and intimidation. Our client invested considerable resources into a lawful project. One of their lawyers said, waving glossy photograph of the cabin. The defendant acted recklessly, causing emotional distress and financial loss. Emotional distress? I had lost sleep because of their illegal cabin, not the other way around. My turn came next. I spoke plainly, without flair, without theatrics. I told the story of my ranch, the history of the land, and the sudden appearance of the illegal cabin. I explained how I had documented everything, how I had attempted to verify ownership, and how I had no choice but to remove the structure. I could feel some of the courtroom shifting, people intrigued, maybe even rooting for the underdog. Outside the courthouse, the world felt different. The news of my legal battle spread quickly through the community. Local newspapers ran stories with headlines like, "Rancher versus HOA, who really owns the land?" and "David takes on Goliath, illegal cabin demolished." Social media lit up with comments, videos, and memes. Some called me a hero. Others called me reckless. I didn't care. I knew the truth. But as the days passed, the HOA's attacks escalated. Their lawyers filed motions, demanded hearings, and tried to paint me as a dangerous vigilante who couldn't follow the law. They even brought in experts to argue that the cabin had sentimental value to imaginary investors. The courtroom became a circus, and I was the unwilling star. Through it all, I found an unexpected ally, the community. Neighbors brought over evidence of the HOA's past overreaches, old surveys, permits that were ignored, photographs of other illegal cabins they had tried to build. One retired surveyor even testified that my land boundaries were perfectly clear, and the cabin was clearly trespassing. I was floored. People I had waved at over the fence for years were suddenly showing up in court, standing beside me, defending my right to my own property. Even with the community behind me, I couldn't shake the tension. Every night, I lay awake thinking about motions, legal jargon, and the possibility that the court could favor them. But then I remembered the sledgehammer, the dust, the broken wood. That cabin had no right to be there, and I had done what I had to do. I wasn't ashamed. I was prepared to fight, no matter how long it took. Weeks turned into months. Court dates blurred together, each one a roller coaster of strategy, arguments, and counter-arguments. The HOA seemed to thrive on chaos, throwing every trick they could find. I learned more legal terminology than I ever thought I would. Lien, injunction, tort, adverse possession. Words I used to hear on TV became my daily language. And then, just when I thought I might be getting the hang of it, they dropped the bomb, a motion to freeze my property. They wanted the court to restrict any further modifications or actions on my ranch until the case was resolved. The nerve. They had trespassed, built illegally, and now they were trying to dictate what I could do with my own land. My blood boiled, but my lawyer stayed calm. "We'll fight it," he said. And fight it we did. The motion hearing was intense. Lawyers shouted over each other. Evidence was scrutinized under microscopes, literally, in some cases. I sat quietly, letting my team do the talking, my hands gripping the edges of my chair until my knuckles turned white. And when the judge finally ruled in my favor, allowing me to maintain full control of my ranch, the relief was almost physical. I felt like I could breathe again. Almost. Because while I had won a battle, the war wasn't over. The HOA had money, resources, and determination. They would appeal. They would find new ways to make life difficult. And I had to be ready. But for the first time, I also realized something crucial. I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for every rancher, every landowner, every person who had ever been bullied by an overreaching authority. My little act of defiance, the sledgehammer, the broken cabin, the dust in my lungs, had become a symbol. And as I looked out over my lake, the sun dipping behind the hills, I knew this was just a beginning. The cabin may have been gone, but the story, the war, was only getting started. And I, armed with my tools, my evidence, and my stubbornness, was ready for whatever came next. By the time Section 3 of this war rolled around, the fight was no longer just about a cabin. It had transformed into something much bigger, a clash of wills, a test of endurance, and a study in human stubbornness. The HOA had lost the first major motions in court, but that didn't stop them. Oh no, losing seemed to fuel them. It was as if every ruling against them added gasoline to a fire they were determined to keep burning. It started with small things. Strange notices in my mailbox, letters demanding access to inspect my property. They wanted to survey my ranch at their convenience, under the guise of legal procedure. I read one letter, blinked, then laughed in disbelief. Inspect my land? You built a cabin illegally, and now you want a guided tour. I showed the letter to my lawyer, Sam, who gave me a grim smile. This is harassment, he said. We'll file a motion to stop it. And stop it we did, but the harassment didn't stop there. Then the HOA began what I can only describe as a campaign of subtle intimidation. One morning, I woke up to find fresh tire tracks near the lake. Someone had driven over the grassy banks, leaving deep ruts. No note, no explanation. Just a silent message that I wasn't alone, that they were watching. I started locking gates, setting up cameras, and even sleeping with my dog at the front door. I was a rancher defending land. Yes, but I was also a man who realized the battle had turned personal. Around this time, I discovered something unexpected. The HOA wasn't as united as they appeared. Behind closed doors, members were arguing. Some thought I should be left alone. Others were obsessed with proving a point. I got wind of it from neighbors who overheard phone calls and casual conversations. For a fleeting moment, it gave me hope. If I could exploit their divisions, maybe I could turn this tide. But hope didn't make the threats disappear. One day, I returned from checking the perimeter to find the remnants of a small bonfire near my barn. Someone had burned debris, but not the cabin debris, the leftover wood from old ranch projects. They were sending a message, we can reach you anywhere. My heart pounded as I stumped out the embers. Every step, every sound in my own ranch now felt like potential threat. Court dates became more frequent. Each session was a performance, a mixture of legal strategy and psychological warfare. Their lawyers thrived on theatrics, presenting charts, diagrams, and emotional testimony about imaginary losses. Meanwhile, I had Sam, my evidence, and the truth on my side. But even truth can feel fragile when weighed against suits, polished shoes, and prepared statements. Then came the twist I never expected. During a routine court session, a surprise witness appeared, a former HOA board member. They testified, reluctantly but truthfully, that the cabin had never been approved legally and that the HOA's actions on multiple properties were often overreach. The courtroom erupted. The judge leaned forward, scribbling notes. Even their lawyers looked momentarily stunned. I sat back, trying not to smile too much, feeling like I had just been handed a secret weapon I didn't know existed. Buoyed by this, I returned to the ranch with renewed energy. The adrenaline from the courtroom victory collided with the reality of everyday life on my land. I repaired the damage from the tire tracks, reinforced gates, and installed additional cameras. Each new precaution felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim not just a land, but my peace of mind. But the HOA wasn't done. No, they escalated further. Late one night, I noticed someone near the lake's edge, a shadow among the trees. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, my boots sinking into soft soil. Whoever it was had vanished, but they left behind a crudely spray-painted message on a tree. Next time, think twice. The mixture of anger, fear, and determination inside me became almost tangible. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a personal vendetta. I decided to fight back in ways they couldn't anticipate. I documented everything: more photos, video footage from cameras, timestamps, witness statements. I even started keeping a detailed diary of incidents, conversations, and strange occurrences. Each entry became a testament to the lengths they were willing to go and a shield for me in the legal arena. Amid the chaos, there were moments of unexpected levity. One day, I caught a neighbor trying to prank the HOA by installing a fake cabin sign in their parking lot, complete with a tiny model cabin. The sight of it made me laugh harder than I had in weeks. For a brief moment, humor reminded me why I love this community: resilience, cleverness, and the ability to stand together. But even as I laughed, I knew I couldn't underestimate them. The HOA was resourceful and vindictive. They started sending letters threatening injunctions, claims of harassment, and, bizarrely, demands for my cattle to be relocated because they allegedly trespassed onto their property they didn't even own. Each letter arrived with a smug confidence, as if the pen itself carried authority. I tore each one open with a mix of irritation and incredulity. Then came the day that truly tested my resolve. I received a legal notice that the HOA had filed for a temporary restraining order, claiming that my presence on certain parts of the ranch constituted trespassing on their land. I read it twice. I checked my deeds, my surveys, even my old tax documents. Everything clearly showed my boundaries. Yet here was the HOA trying to wrest control through the courts. I met Sam at the courthouse, and we spent hours poring over the filings. "They are desperate," he said. "This is a last-ditch attempt to scare you into submission. We'll fight it, and we'll win." I nodded, trying to feel confidence. But deep down, a part of me wondered, how far would they go? How personal would this get? That night, I walked the ranch alone, flashlight in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. The flattened cabin, the tire tracks, the bonfire, the spray-painted threats, the endless letters. My ranch, my sanctuary, had become a battlefield. And yet, as I gazed at the lake, calm and reflective under the moonlight, I realized something vital. This fight wasn't just about property. It was about standing up to intimidation, defending boundaries, and refusing to let fear dictate my life. And just as I was thinking that, the wind carried a faint sound from the far side of the lake. Footsteps, subtle but deliberate. I froze. Whoever it was, they weren't just trying to make a point. They were testing me, and I knew, in that moment, that this war would continue in ways I couldn't yet predict. Because in battles like this, victory isn't just about winning in court. It's about endurance, resilience, and the ability to stay true to your principles when every force around you is trying to break you. And I wasn't broken. Not yet. This was far from over. And if the HOA thought a few letters, a few threats, or even a restraining order could intimidate me, they had another thing coming. By the time Section 4 rolled around, it felt like the entire world, or at least a world of local landowners, was watching. The flattened cabin had become more than a story. It was a symbol of defiance, a cautionary tale for bureaucrats and overreaching authorities. And the HOA, they weren't just fighting, they were obsessed. It started subtly at first. Notices in the mail, copies of motions, friendly reminders about alleged trespassing. Then the harassment turned more aggressive. One morning, I drove down the main path of my ranch and found a collection of bright orange stakes marking sections of land. According to the notes pinned to them, these markers claimed boundaries that didn't exist. My ranch, my land. Suddenly, the simple act of walking across my property felt like navigating a legal minefield. I called Sam immediately. He shook his head in disbelief. "This is bold. They are trying to create facts on the ground. Literally. Don't touch those markers, and we'll challenge them in court." I felt a mix of frustration and exhilaration. Bold moves require bold responses, and I was ready. Court dates multiplied. It felt like living in a revolving door of hearings, motions, and countermotions. The HOA's lawyers were relentless, submitting pages upon pages of documentation, claims, and, in some cases, what seemed like pure fiction. One document even included a timeline claiming that I had planned the destruction of the cabin weeks before I even saw it. The audacity left me speechless. But there were victories, too. Evidence I had meticulously gathered, photos, historical surveys, community testimony, began to tip the scales. A retired surveyor's testimony was particularly compelling. He clearly demonstrated the illegal placement of the cabin and refuted every claim about my alleged trespass. Even the judge, who had remained impartial but strict, raised an eyebrow at the HOA's increasingly desperate claims. Still, the battle wasn't limited to the courtroom. The HOA had figured out that I lived by patterns. They started sending letters timed with farm deliveries, supposedly to observe compliance. But I knew better. Every vehicle that drove onto my property was now a potential risk, every shadow near the lake a possible intruder. I upgraded cameras, installed motion sensors, and even reinforced fences. My ranch had transformed into a fortified stronghold, but it still felt vulnerable. Then came the real escalation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I found part of my barn gate vandalized, scratched with the words, "This isn't over." My blood ran cold. They were no longer hiding behind legal documents. This was intimidation in the flesh. I took photos, called Sam, and filed a report with the sheriff. Even then, I knew that the real war wasn't about law. It was about nerve, pressure, and fear. Despite the pressure, I found unexpected allies in the community. Neighbors started showing up during court hearings, quietly standing behind me, offering evidence, moral support, and even helping repair minor damages on the ranch. One elderly rancher, who had been silent for decades, told me, "You remind us that boundaries mean something. They are trying to erase that." His words hit harder than any legal argument. I wasn't fighting alone. I had a coalition, and that gave me a quiet, powerful strength. The courtroom drama reached a new peak when the HOA attempted to introduce emotional distress claims. They brought in actors, supposedly neighbors, claiming that my demolition of the cabin caused them trauma. I sat through the testimony, jaw clenched, wondering if this was serious or absurd theater. Sam whispered to me afterward, "They are grasping at straws. Ignore the theatrics and stick to facts." The facts, thankfully, were solid. Surveys, photos, and historical property records left no room for ambiguity. Then came the turning point. During one particularly tense hearing, the judge asked for clarification on the HOA's authority. When their lawyers struggled to produce documentation proving they had the right to build on my land, the room fell silent. Even the most confident members of the HOA looked uncertain. It was a small victory, but in a war of attrition, small victories mattered more than anything. Back at the ranch, I took a moment to breathe. The lake glimmered, the hills stretched endlessly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of calm. I realized that I had survived countless threats, harassment, and intimidation, and I had still managed to protect what was mine. But the fight was far from over. The HOA had resources, determination, and a taste for revenge. The following weeks brought more challenges. Unexpected inspections, legal filings, and threats kept me on edge. One morning, I discovered someone had left a broken lock on the barn, another warning that my defenses could be breached. My ranch had become a place of constant vigilance. Every sound, every movement, felt loaded with potential danger. Sleep became a luxury. Attention to detail became a survival skill. Despite the pressure, I continued to document everything. Each incident, each motion, each letter became a piece of armor in the legal battle. Photographs of trespass markers, videos of suspicious vehicles, time-stamped records of fence repairs, all of it created a comprehensive narrative that could withstand the HOA's assaults. I became meticulous, almost obsessive, in protecting not just my land, but the story of my fight. And yet, the most unexpected twist was how the public began to respond. Social media turned the story into a cause célèbre. Videos of the cabin demolition, photos of the lake and ranch, and commentary on the HOA's overreach went viral in local circles. People started offering advice, sharing similar experiences, and even sending symbolic gifts, homemade ranch defender signs and handwritten notes of encouragement. The support was overwhelming. For every threat, there was a message reminding me why I was fighting. But the HOA didn't relent. They filed another motion, this one seeking damages for interruption of potential investments. The argument was thin, almost laughable, but it forced me back into the courtroom, facing another round of debates, charts, and legal jargon. It was exhausting, mentally and physically, but Sam kept me focused. Stick to the facts. Ignore the drama. You've got the law and the truth on your side. By now, the story of my flattened cabin and the ensuing war had taken on a life of its own. Friends, neighbors, even strangers reached out to share advice, moral support, or simply to marvel at the audacity of the conflict. I realized that what had started as a personal fight had become something bigger, a story about standing up for what's right, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. And yet, I couldn't ignore the tension. Every morning, I walked my property, checking fences, cameras, and boundaries, knowing that the HOA, or someone acting on their behalf, could escalate further. The stakes were no longer just legal, they were personal. Every action I took, every defensive measure I installed, became a statement. I will not be intimidated. As I stood on the edge of the lake one evening, watching the sunset behind the hills, I reflected on how far I had come. From a simple act of removing an illegal cabin to a full-blown legal and psychological battle, my life had changed dramatically. But with every challenge, my resolve strengthened. I was no longer just a rancher protecting property. I was a symbol of resistance, determination, and vigilance. The HOA may have thought they could scare me, overwhelm me, and control the narrative. But they underestimated one thing: my connection to this land, my preparation, and my unshakable determination. The war had escalated, yes, but so had my readiness. And I knew, deep down, that the fight was far from over. The cabin may have been gone, but the story and the battle was only growing more intense. And in that moment, standing on the edge of the lake, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, I made a silent promise. No matter what the HOA threw at me next, I would stand my ground. I would defend my ranch, my livelihood, and my principles, and I would win. By the time I reached Section 5 of this battle, it was no longer just about a cabin. It had become a full-blown war of wills, a mix of law, intimidation, strategy, and sheer stubbornness. The HOA had exhausted every trick in their playbook, from legal maneuvers to veiled threats on my property. I had strengthened my defenses, documented every inch of my land, and fortified my resolve. But nothing could have prepared me for what was coming next. It started with a surprise motion from their lawyers, a demand for immediate damages and court fees, claiming my actions had caused financial loss beyond the alleged cabin destruction. The legal jargon was exhausting, but the real kicker was the timing. They filed it on the same day a major storm hit the ranch. I remember staring out the window, watching dark clouds roll over the hills, rain pelting the fences, and thinking, perfect. A storm, both literally and metaphorically. The courtroom that day felt like a battlefield. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses whispered, and the judge, an unflinching force of authority, looked ready for whatever theatrics the HOA could muster. Their lead attorney, a man whose confidence seemed engineered, strutted in like he owned the place. He opened with a dramatic statement about irreparable damages and emotional trauma, gesturing to a stack of folders so large it could double as a table. I sat across from them, feeling the adrenaline spike, but this time it was tempered with focus. Sam leaned over and whispered, "Stick to the facts. They can't argue truth." And that's what I did. I recounted every detail: the history of the land, the sudden appearance of the illegal cabin, my attempts to verify ownership, and the meticulous documentation I had gathered. Photographs, time-stamped videos, property surveys, all laid bare before the court. Then came the unexpected twist. One of the HOA's witnesses, someone I had never met but whose testimony they were counting on, completely unraveled on the stand. Under cross-examination, the truth came out. The cabin had been built without approval, permits were falsified, and several HOA board members had knowingly ignored legal boundaries. I could feel the tension shift in the courtroom. For the first time, the momentum was clearly on my side. But the real drama happened outside the courtroom. The storm had left the ranch in a mess, fallen branches, mud-soaked piles, and one fence partially down. I arrived early the next morning to assess the damage and noticed tire tracks cutting across the northern boundary. Someone had been there during the storm. My heart sank. The intimidation was escalating, and the HOA was clearly testing my limits. I immediately called Sam, who advised caution. "We'll include this as evidence of harassment," he said. "But don't confront anyone alone. This could get messy." I nodded, adrenaline and frustration mixing into a sharp determination. Whoever thought they could intimidate me into submission was about to learn exactly what they were dealing with. Community support continued to be a lifeline. Neighbors offered assistance repairing the fence, documenting suspicious activity, and even keeping an eye on the northern boundary when I couldn't. One particularly brave neighbor, a retired sheriff, came to the ranch and helped me set up additional security measures. "These people underestimate how serious ranchers are about their land," he said with a grin. I smiled, realizing I wasn't alone in this fight. Court proceedings became increasingly dramatic. The HOA tried desperate tactics, including calling in an expert witness claiming the cabin had historical significance and even suggesting that my demolition of it constituted a violation of community heritage laws. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Sam objected, and the judge sustained it, cutting off the HOA claim like a knife through paper. As the case approached its climax, tensions outside mirrored those inside the courtroom. The cabin ruins, once quiet evidence, had become a flashpoint for both sides. I started noticing unusual activity at night. Footsteps near the lake, lights flickering in the trees, and a few mysterious vehicles that appeared and disappeared without warning. It was nerve-wracking, but I refused to let fear dictate my actions. Every step I took on my land was deliberate, every decision calculated. Finally, the day of the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, but with community members, journalists, and curious onlookers. The air was thick with anticipation. The HOA lawyers looked confident, as always, but there was a noticeable tension beneath their polished exteriors. I could feel it, their desperation growing with every passing moment. The judge called the hearing to order. The HOA opened with their final arguments, painting me as reckless and antagonistic. Then it was my turn. I spoke calmly, methodically, and with conviction. I presented the evidence, surveys proving my ownership, photographic documentation of the illegal cabin, and records of every instance of harassment and intimidation. I emphasized that my actions were a necessary defense of my property and my rights as a landowner. When the judge spoke, the courtroom went silent. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and unwavering. After reviewing all evidence, it is clear that the defendant acted within his rights. The cabin was built illegally on private property without authorization. The claims of emotional distress and financial loss are without merit. My chest felt light, my hands stopped shaking, and for the first time in months, I felt something like relief. But the victory didn't stop there. The judge continued. Furthermore, any attempt by the HOA to intimidate, trespass, or manipulate legal procedures will be subject to penalties. The defendant is entitled to protect his property and seek damages for any harassment. A collective exhale filled the courtroom. I had won, not just the case, but the battle that had defined my life for months. Back at the ranch, I surveyed the property with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The lake shimmered peacefully, the hills stretched endlessly, and the remnants of the cabin, though gone, now seemed symbolic, a reminder that standing up for what's yours matters. The storm had passed, both literally and metaphorically, leaving behind clarity and renewed strength. The HOA, though furious, had been legally restrained from further harassment. They could appeal, of course, but the victory had shifted the balance. They now faced the undeniable truth: my land, my rules, my rights. And the community, once silent observers, now celebrated a win for every rancher, landowner, and individual who had ever faced bureaucracy run amok. As I sat by the lake that evening, the sun setting in brilliant oranges and purples, I reflected on the journey. From the first shocking sight of the cabin to the courtroom drama, the nighttime threats, and the endless legal filings, I had been tested in ways I never imagined. And yet, standing there, I felt stronger, wiser, and more connected to the land I had fought to protect. I had learned that fighting isn't just about strength or weapons. It's about preparation, evidence, community, and unshakable determination. It's about facing fear and refusing to let intimidation dictate your actions. And most importantly, it's about knowing that some battles are worth every sleepless night, every letter, and every moment of doubt. The cabin was gone. The threats had subsided. And while the HOA may have tried to make me doubt myself, they had failed. The ranch was mine, my story intact, and my resolve unbroken. The showdown had ended, not just in a courtroom victory, but in the triumph of principle over power, determination over bureaucracy, and courage over fear. The court case was over. The cabin was gone. The HOA's threats had been legally restrained, and, for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. But standing on my ranch that morning, looking over the hills, the lake, and the remnants of what had been the center of this storm, I realized something important. This wasn't just a victory over a cabin, an HOA, or a series of aggressive lawyers. It was a victory over doubt, fear, and the idea that power could intimidate someone into giving up what was rightfully theirs. The first weeks after the court ruling were quiet in ways I hadn't expected. The tire tracks stopped appearing. The anonymous messages ceased. Even the subtle pranks and minor acts of intimidation vanished. The HOA, at least for now, seemed to accept that the battle had been lost. And I had time, precious, uninterrupted time, to assess the damage, repair what had been harmed, and reclaim the piece of my land. I began with the physical side of recovery. Fences were mended, gates reinforced, and the lake shoreline cleaned up after months of intrusion. Every repair felt like a small act of reclaiming my sanctuary. The remnants of the cabin were cleared, and I turned them into compost, mulch, and firewood. In a strange way, the debris had come full circle. The material that represented illegal intrusion now served a purpose, nourishing the land I had fought to protect. But it wasn't just about bricks, wood, and nails. The emotional toll of months of harassment, late-night anxiety, and courtroom battles was something I had to contend with. I found myself waking early, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the journey. I thought about fear, frustration, and the countless moments when I had wondered if I could endure another day. And then I thought about resilience, determination, and the power of standing your ground. The balance between fear and courage had defined this fight, and I had learned just how strong I could be when I refused to back down. The community's role in this story cannot be understated. Neighbors who had once been casual acquaintances became allies, witnesses, and moral support. One neighbor even joked, "You made all of us feel like we could take on the world." Their support had been more than helpful, it had been sustaining. I realized that battles aren't fought in isolation. Even the strongest, most determined individual benefits from the encouragement, wisdom, and solidarity of those around them. I also reflected on the HOA itself, not as an abstract antagonist, but as a cautionary tale. They had power, resources, and a certain audacious confidence, yet their overreach had exposed them to accountability. Their obsession with control, their attempts at intimidation, and their relentless pursuit of dominance were ultimately their undoing. It was a lesson in how authority, when unchecked or misused, eventually meets resistance. And sometimes that resistance comes from the most unexpected places: a rancher, a sledgehammer, and a well-documented case of common sense. In the days that followed, I noticed small, subtle changes in how I approached the ranch. I walked the property with a heightened awareness, checking boundaries not just for legal purposes but as a form of mindfulness. Every tree, fence post, and path carried a story now, reminders of what had been challenged and what had been defended. My connection to the land deepened, not just physically, but emotionally and philosophically. I understood in a more visceral way why people fight for their homes, their properties, and their sanctuaries. I also began sharing the story, cautiously at first. Family, friends, and neighbors were curious, and as I recounted the sequence of events, the cabin appearing out of nowhere, the sledgehammer, the letters, the courtroom battles, I noticed something remarkable. People weren't just entertained, they were inspired. The story resonated because it wasn't just about property law or a conflict with an HOA. It was about courage, standing up for what's right, and refusing to let fear dictate your actions. And yes, There were lessons learned along the way. Documentation is everything. Evidence is power. Preparation can outweigh brute strength. Community matters more than you think. And sometimes, even when it seems like bureaucracy, intimidation, or authority has all the cards, the truth, diligence, and moral clarity can prevail. These weren't abstract lessons. They were lived experiences etched into every fence post, every photograph, and every court transcript. One afternoon, I walked down to the lake, sat on the dock, and tossed a line into the water. The lake was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The cabin was gone. The HOA's shadow had faded, and yet the fight lingered in memory, not as a trauma, but as a story, a testament. I realized that the struggle had changed me. I was more patient, more strategic, and more aware of what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. The fight had not just defended my property, it had fortified my sense of self. Even months later, there were reminders. Occasionally, letters arrived, sometimes legal notices from distant branches of the HOA. But I approached them differently now, with calm preparation and the certainty that I had already endured far worse. I no longer reacted out of anger or fear. Instead, I reviewed, documented, and responded strategically. The lessons of the battle had left me stronger and wiser. The story, however, didn't just belong to me. It belonged to everyone who had watched, read, or heard about the saga. The Flattened cabin, once a symbol of intrusion and conflict, had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and resistance. People reached out, sharing their own experiences of overreach, intimidation, and standing their ground. The story became bigger than one rancher or one property. It became a narrative about justice, principle, and the enduring power of truth. As the sun set over the hills that evening, I stood on the porch, reflecting on the journey. From shock and anger at the sight of the cabin to the adrenaline of demolition, the fear of harassment, the stress of legal battles, and finally the quiet triumph of justice, the story had come full circle. The land was mine, the HOA restrained, and the lessons indelibly etched into my mind. And yet, in the quiet, I understood something essential. Battles like this never truly end. They leave ripples, lessons for the future, warnings for those who might overreach, and inspiration for anyone facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. My ranch would remain peaceful, my boundaries respected, but the story would continue, through conversations, shared experiences, and the enduring reminder that standing up for what's yours is always worth a fight. As I watched the last rays of sun glitter across the lake, I felt a profound sense of closure. Not just because the HOA had been defeated, not just because the land was safe, but because I had endured, adapted, and emerged stronger. The journey had tested me in ways I could never have imagined, but it had also revealed the depth of my resilience, the strength of community, and the power of standing firm when everything seems against you. The cabin was gone. The HOA had lost. And I had learned something priceless. The true value of your land isn't just in the soil, water, or trees. It's in the courage, persistence, and integrity of the person willing to defend it. And with that, the ranch was quiet again, the wind rustling through the trees like a soft victory song. I took a deep breath, picked up my fishing rod, and smiled. I had survived. I had won. And the story of a cabin, an HOA, and a determined rancher would live on,